My name is Alina Marsh. I'm 43 years old and I work as a marketing director for a regional home goods retailer based just outside Portland, Oregon. On a Sunday afternoon in September, 8 months after my last chemotherapy infusion, my mother called me while I was unloading groceries in my own kitchen and asked, without so much as a "how are you feeling?" whether I could put $6,000 toward my sister Brooke's kitchen renovation because, in her words, "You're finally back on your feet and family takes care of family." I stood there for a moment with a carton of eggs still in my hand, listening to my mother talk, unbothered about quartz countertops and farmhouse sinks, and I found myself doing something I hadn't expected to do, counting. Not the money, the calls. I counted, in the 4 seconds it took her to finish a sentence about Brooke's tile samples, how many times my mother had called me during the 11 months I spent in active treatment for stage 2 invasive breast cancer. The number I landed on, a number I would later confirm with total precision, was 3. 3 calls across 11 months, 4 surgeries, 16 rounds of chemotherapy, and 28 days of radiation. My father called even less. My sister, the one currently asking through our mother for $6,000 toward a kitchen she didn't need, visited exactly once for 40 minutes 3 days after my double mastectomy, and spent most of that visit on her phone finalizing seating charts for her own upcoming baby shower. "Alina, are you there?" my mother said when I didn't answer right away. "I'm here," I said. I set the eggs down on the counter, carefully, the way you set something down when you've decided you're not going to let your hand shake while you're holding it. "I'll think about it." I didn't tell her that afternoon about the folder sitting in my home office, 3 rooms away, the one I'd started keeping almost by accident during the worst stretch of chemo, back when I was too exhausted most days to do anything except lie on my couch, and on the days my hands weren't shaking too badly, jot down dates. I didn't tell her about the 17 hospital and treatment appointments I'd attended completely alone, driving myself to and from a chair where a nurse pumped poison into my arm to save my life, because there had been no one else available to sit with me. I didn't tell her that I had by then quietly stopped waiting for any of them to show up, and had built instead an entirely different kind of family around myself, one made up of people who had never once missed a call. I told her I'd think about the $6,000, and I meant it, in a way she couldn't have possibly understood in that moment, standing in my own kitchen with a carton of eggs and 11 months of silence between us. Because I had already decided several weeks earlier exactly what I was going to give my family, and it wasn't going to be money. I want to describe that kitchen a little more because I remember it with unusual clarity, the way you remember a room attached to a moment that quietly finishes something. The late afternoon light was coming in low through the window over the sink, catching the dust on the counter I hadn't wiped down yet. My mother's voice kept going cheerfully about backsplash tile, entirely unaware that on my end of the line I had stopped listening to the words and started, instead, running a private, silent tally I'd apparently been keeping somewhere in the back of my mind for almost a year without fully admitting it to myself. 3 calls, 2 chemo visits, 40 minutes at my bedside after major surgery. I stood there letting her talk, nodding occasionally into a phone she couldn't see me nodding into. And I understood with a calm that surprised me more than anger would have, that this conversation, this exact ordinary Sunday afternoon, was the last one in which she would get to describe my illness as something I'd simply handled on my own, as though handling it alone had been a preference rather than the only option anyone in my family had actually left available to me. "Alina, are you even listening to me?" my mother asked, a note of mild irritation creeping into her voice. "I am," I said. "I'm just thinking about everything it took to get back on my feet." I let that sentence sit there for a moment, deliberately watching to see if she'd hear the weight underneath it. She didn't. She simply said, "Well, you always were resourceful," and moved straight back to quartz countertops. And in that small missed opening, I understood something I hadn't fully let myself understand until that exact second. I could hand her the truth plainly, gently, and she would still reflexively catch it and turn it into a compliment about my strength, because that reflex had been 32 years in the making, and one sentence over the phone wasn't going to end it. It was going to take something considerably more deliberate than a sentence. I want to take you through this whole year in order because I think the shape of it matters more than any single moment inside it. The specific way a family can be perfectly present for the easy years and then simply, quietly vanish the moment presence actually costs them something. I'll tell you up front, I recovered, fully as of this recording, cancer-free for 14 months. But I did not recover the way anyone in my family expected me to, and I did not come out the other side of it willing to hand them back the exact same daughter and sister I was before any of this started. There's a specific moment from that Sunday afternoon phone call I haven't mentioned yet, and I want to include it here at the very start because it's the sentence that finally, after 11 months, told me everything I needed to know about how my family had experienced my illness. Near the end of the call, almost as an afterthought, my mother said lightly, "You handled it all so well, honestly. It's not like you needed us hovering, you've always figured things out on your own." I remember standing very still in my kitchen when she said that, because I understood in that single sentence that my mother had managed to transform her own absence into a compliment about my strength. That's the machinery of it, and I want to name it early, plainly, the way I couldn't for most of that year. When a family member reframes their abandonment as your independence, they get to keep their comfort and your gratitude at the same time. I didn't feel grateful. I felt something colder and more precise settle into place, the last piece of a picture I'd been quietly assembling since March. Welcome back to the channel. If you've ever been sick or struggling or simply in need, and discovered that the people who were supposed to show up first were the last ones through the door, this story is for you. Stay until the end because the reversal in this one isn't loud and it isn't cruel, but it is, I promise you, complete. If any part of what I've already told you sounds familiar, tell me in the comments. Has your family ever mistaken your resilience for permission to disappear? Let me take you back to where this pattern actually began long before any diagnosis, because I don't want you to think my family's absence during my illness was some strange, isolated failure. It was, in fact, the most consistent thing about me. I grew up in Beaverton, a suburb just west of Portland, the older of two daughters born to Roy and Denise Marsh. My father spent 31 years as a facilities manager for the local school district. My mother worked part-time as a receptionist at a dental office and more consistently, full-time as the household's emotional director, a role she performed with total confidence and very little self-awareness about how unevenly she distributed her attention between her two daughters. I was born in 1982, 4 years ahead of my sister Brooke. From almost as early as I can remember, I was cast as the responsible one, a phrase my mother used so often, and so approvingly that I didn't understand until my 30s that it was never actually a compliment. It was a job description assigned to a child too young to negotiate its terms. Brooke, 4 years younger, warmer, more easily delighted by the world, more visibly in need of protection simply by virtue of being the baby, was cast just as early as the sensitive one, a label that in practice meant she was excused from almost every hard thing our family ever asked of anyone, on the grounds that hard things might overwhelm her. Here's a memory that tells you almost everything you need to know about how that division worked in practice. I was 11, Brooke was 7, and our grandmother, my mother's own mother, passed away somewhat suddenly of a stroke. I remember my mother sitting me down the night before the funeral and explaining, gently but with total clarity, that Brooke would be staying home with a neighbor because funerals are too much for someone her age, and that I would be attending, seated beside my mother, because you're older. And you can handle it. I was 11 years old, standing in a black dress 2 sizes too big, handling my grandmother's funeral so that my 7-year-old sister could be protected from a feeling I was apparently already old enough to absorb on the whole family's behalf. Second memory, 15 years old this time. I broke my wrist falling off a friend's trampoline on a Saturday afternoon and drove myself badly, one-handed, in genuine pain, to the walk-in clinic 3 miles from our house because both of my parents were at Brooke's dance recital and, as my mother explained afterward, apologetically but not urgently, we couldn't just leave in the middle of her solo, sweetheart, you understand. I did understand at the time because I had already, by 15, absorbed the family's central unspoken rule. Brooke's moments were events. Mine were logistics to be handled ideally by me, with as little disruption to everyone else's schedule as possible. Third memory, and this one belongs to Brooke almost as much as to me, though I didn't understand its full shape until much later. At 17, I was accepted with a partial scholarship into an out-of-state summer journalism program I'd worked for 2 years to qualify for. My mother, reviewing the acceptance letter over dinner, said, carefully, "That's wonderful, Alina, but I do wonder if it's the right summer with your sister starting middle school. She really does look up to you being around." I gave up the program. I told myself at 17 that it was a reasonable, loving choice, the kind any good older sister would make. I understand now, looking back with the clarity this past year finally gave me, that it was the first of many times I would be asked to shrink my own life slightly so that my presence could remain available for whatever Brooke's life needed instead. A fourth memory belongs here too, because it explains something about my father that matters later in this story. I was 20, home from college for a summer, and I overheard him on the phone with his own mother, my grandmother, apologizing at length for something minor, a missed birthday call, I think, though I never learned the exact detail. I remember being struck by how easily the apology came to him, how fluent he was in it, speaking to his own mother. I didn't hear that same fluency directed at me, or really at anyone in our immediate household, for another 23 years. I understand now that my father was capable of a kind of tenderness he simply never practiced inside his own home, where my mother's comfort had somewhere along the way become the household's central organizing principle, one he'd apparently decided decades earlier wasn't worth the friction of ever quietly pushing back against. I want to move through the years quickly here because the pattern established in childhood simply repeated itself with higher dollar figures and higher stakes, well into my adult life, long before any diagnosis entered the picture, and I think it's important for you to see how thoroughly the groundwork was laid. In 2004, the year I turned 22 and graduated from Portland State with a degree in marketing, Brooke, then 18, was accepted into a private culinary arts program with an $11,400 first-year tuition bill our parents hadn't budgeted for. My father, over dinner that August, asked whether I'd be willing to help out a little with my first full paycheck from an entry-level marketing job I'd just started, just until we figure out the loan situation. I contributed $2,200 that year, roughly a third of my post-tax income at the time, toward a tuition bill for a program I had never been offered any equivalent support to pursue myself 4 years earlier. My mother's line, delivered warmly over the same dinner, "You've always been so generous, Alina, it's just who you are." I remember feeling proud of that sentence at 22. I understand now that it was the first of many times generosity would be assigned to me as a personality trait rather than acknowledged as a specific, costly choice I kept making over and over, usually under quiet pressure. By 2007, I was 25, working steadily, saving carefully for a first apartment down payment. My parents' roof needed replacing that spring, a legitimate $8,600 expense, not extravagant, simply necessary. I covered $3,000 of it at my father's request, framed as a loan that was never repaid, and as far as I can tell, never actually tracked by either of us in writing. Brooke, 21 that year, midway through her culinary program, contributed nothing, and nothing was ever asked of her because, as my mother explained when I gently raised the imbalance once, "She's still finding her footing, Alina, you're already so stable." I didn't push further. I told myself stability was simply the reward for responsibility, and that resenting the imbalance would make me smaller, not bigger. That was my rationalization for most of my 20s, that being needed less visibly than Brooke wasn't a wound, it was a compliment I hadn't yet learned to properly enjoy. A small warmth beat because my family wasn't the whole world even then. That same year I met my eventual husband Marcus at a mutual friend's barbecue. And for the 6 years we were married before our amicable divorce in 2016, he was one of the only people who ever said out loud unprompted, "You know your family runs you a little ragged, right?" I used to laugh it off. I think about that observation more now than I did at the time. In 2008, the year I turned 26, my father lost his facilities job for 6 months during a district budget crisis, and I covered $1,800 of my parents' mortgage payments across that stretch, at my mother's request, framed, as always, as temporary. Brooke, 22 that year, freshly graduated from her culinary program and working an entry-level line cook position, was never asked to contribute $1 on the grounds my mother explained, that she's just starting out, Alina, she needs every bit of that paycheck for herself. I remember doing the math quietly in my head and realizing that I had been just starting out myself only 4 years earlier, and nobody had extended me the same grace. I didn't say anything out loud. I told myself once again that pointing out the imbalance would make me look petty, small, ungenerous, the exact opposite of the reliable daughter I'd spent 26 years being praised for being. In 2010, Brooke, 24 by then, moved back in with our parents temporarily after a relationship ended, a temporary arrangement that would end up lasting 14 months. During that stretch, my mother called me at least twice a month asking for small amounts. $150 here for Brooke's car insurance, $300 there for a security deposit on an apartment Brooke ultimately never moved into, always framed as short-term bridges, never once repaid, never once tracked. I estimated, years later, going back through old bank statements during the same folder building process that would eventually become central to this story, that I contributed just over $4,100 to my sister's various temporary needs across that 14-month stretch alone. My father's line, the one time I asked directly whether any of it would be repaid, "It's not a loan between siblings, Alina, it's just family helping family. You'll understand when you have kids of your own to help someday." I didn't have kids. I understand now that the sentence was never really about kids. It was about making sure I understood my role was permanent, regardless of whose life stage justified the current request. I want to include one specific evening from that stretch, because it's the first time I remember genuinely losing my composure with my mother, even briefly. It was a Tuesday in that October, and she'd called asking for $400 toward a security deposit Brooke needed by the following morning, an amount that would have left my own checking account uncomfortably thin 2 weeks before my own rent was due. I asked carefully whether Brooke had looked into a payment plan or asked her boyfriend at the time to help, or considered any option that didn't run directly through me. My mother's voice sharpened in a way I rarely heard from her. "Why does it matter where it comes from, Alina, as long as it gets solved? Must you make everything a whole production?" I sent the $400 within the hour. I remember lying awake that night, unable to sleep, turning her sentence over and over, "Must you make everything a whole production?" A sentence that would, over the following 13 years, come to feel like the closest thing my mother ever offered to an actual philosophy of parenting. That need when it came from me was a production to be managed and minimized, and that need when it came from Brooke simply was, requiring no justification at all. Year 9, 2013. Brooke got engaged that spring to a kind, unremarkable man named Dale, and the wedding, when it happened the following June, cost, by my mother's own later admission, just over $34,000, a figure my parents covered almost entirely by dipping into a retirement account 6 years before they'd planned to. I contributed $2,800 myself toward the flowers and the rehearsal dinner at my mother's direct request, framed as the kind of thing an older sister just does. I remember standing in the reception hall that June, genuinely happy for Brooke, and also feeling something small and unnamed twist quietly in my chest. Watching my parents beam through a toast about how they'd always give their girls everything, while I stood a few feet away, having personally funded a fifth of the flowers for an event nobody had ever offered to help me pay for anything comparable toward, in a life where, as it happened, I'd never once been offered a wedding of comparable scale to begin with, having married in a courthouse with 11 guests 3 years earlier. I want to describe the toast itself a little further because a specific line from it has stayed lodged in me for over a decade. My father, glass raised mid-speech, said, "Denise and I always said we'd give our girls everything we could." I remember scanning the room during that sentence, looking for some flicker of acknowledgement that everything had in practice meant a fully funded wedding for one daughter and a modest self-funded courthouse ceremony for the other 3 years earlier that neither parent had attended in person, citing a scheduling conflict with a church retreat they'd committed to months in advance. I didn't find that flicker. I don't think either of my parents had ever once connected those two facts in their own minds, because doing so would have required holding both daughters' experiences in view at the same time, a kind of comparison our family had never once in my entire life been asked to perform. A small warmth beat, my father's older sister, my Aunt Patris, pulled me aside at that same reception and said, quietly refilling my wine glass without being asked, "You know you're allowed to want things too, right, honey? Somebody in this family ought to say that to you eventually." I laughed it off the way I laughed most things off in my 30s. I kept that sentence longer than I let on. A brief reminder, if this story is resonating with you, go ahead and hit subscribe now, because everything that finally exposed my family's true priorities is coming up in the second half, and it's genuinely worth staying for. This was the year of my divorce from Marcus, finalized in April, amicable but still, undeniably, one of the harder stretches of my adult life. My mother's first reaction over the phone the week I told her, "Well, I hope you're not going to let this turn you bitter, sweetheart. Brooke and Dale are trying for a baby right now, and it would be nice if you could be happy for them during all this." I remember sitting on my kitchen floor after that call, 34 years old, freshly divorced, being asked, in the same breath as my own loss being acknowledged, to manage my sister's timeline instead. I didn't say anything sharp back. I said, "Of course I'm happy for them," and I meant it mostly because Brooke herself had never done anything cruel to me directly. It would take years for me to fully understand that the cruelty in my family rarely came from Brooke's actions. It came from my parents' relentless, practiced habit of positioning her comfort as the priority in every room, regardless of what else was actually happening in it. I want to include one more detail from that year because it's a smaller moment that nonetheless stayed with me. Marcus, in one of our last conversations before the divorce was finalized, said something I didn't fully appreciate until much later. I hope you find people eventually who show up for you the way you show up for everybody else. I tried, but I don't think I was ever enough for the job your family assigned you. I remember being a little stung by that at the time, hearing it as criticism of my own choices rather than what I now understand it to have been a genuinely perceptive, if painfully accurate, observation about a role I'd been carrying for so long that I could no longer imagine setting it down, even for the person who'd married me. In 2018, I was promoted to marketing director, the culmination of 9 years of steady, deliberate work, a $22,000 raise that represented at the time the single proudest professional achievement of my life. I called my mother the evening I got the news, expecting foolishly perhaps that this might be the one accomplishment large enough to earn its own moment, incomplete with anything happening in Brooke's life. My mother congratulated me warmly for about 90 seconds before pivoting to tell me that Brooke's younger daughter had just said her first full sentence that same week, and did I want to hear a recording. I said yes, of course, and listened to 11 seconds of a toddler saying "more juice please" with what I hope sounded like genuine warmth, because I did feel genuine warmth for my niece. What I didn't feel, standing in my kitchen holding a promotion I'd worked 9 years for, was the sense that my own milestone had been allowed to simply exist, uncontested for even the length of a single phone call. In 2019, my father had a minor cardiac event, a stent procedure, nothing life-threatening but frightening in the moment. I took 11 days off work, unpaid beyond what my limited PTO covered, to manage his post-procedure care, coordinate with his cardiologist, and handle 2 weeks of meal prep and medication schedules for both my parents. Brooke, 33 by then, living 40 minutes away, visited twice during those 11 days, for roughly an hour each time, citing her own 2 young children's schedules as the reason she couldn't do more. My mother's line, delivered with genuine warmth, thanking me at the end of that stretch: "I don't know what we'd do without you, Alina. You're just built differently than Brooke, she's more delicate." I remember hearing that sentence and feeling for the first time with real clarity something that wasn't quite anger yet but was close to it, the specific, cold recognition that built different had been doing an enormous amount of quiet, unpaid labor in my family for 37 years, and that nobody in that family had ever once asked whether I wanted to be built that way, or whether I'd simply had no other option offered to me from the time I was 11 years old in a black dress 2 sizes too big. I want to include one more detail from those 11 days, because it foreshadows something important. On the 9th day, exhausted, having barely slept, managing my father's medication schedule alongside my own full-time job, I asked my mother directly whether Brooke might take the following 2 days so I could catch up on work. My mother's response was immediate and unhesitating. "Oh, I don't think that's realistic for her right now, honey, with the kids' schedules." "But you're almost done, just push through, you're so close." I pushed through, I always pushed through. It would take a cancer diagnosis 4 years later to finally teach me that pushing through was not, in fact, a personality trait I possessed. It was a demand that had simply never once in my entire adult life been placed on anyone else in that house. I want to slow down considerably here because this is the part of the story that matters most, and I want to walk you through it month by month, the way I lived it, rather than compressing it the way I compressed the 15 years before it. I found the lump myself during a routine self-exam on a Tuesday morning in February. The biopsy 2 weeks later confirmed stage 2 invasive ductal carcinoma, estrogen receptor positive, in my left breast. I called my mother that same afternoon, sitting in my car in the imaging center's parking lot, my hands not quite steady on the steering wheel. Her first response, after a pause that felt considerably longer than it probably actually was: "Oh, Alina. Okay, let's not panic. What does the doctor actually say the odds are?" I remember answering her question calmly, methodically, the way I answer most things, and I remember, even in that moment, some small, watchful part of me noting that she hadn't asked how I was feeling. She'd asked for a number, the way you'd ask a stranger for a weather forecast. She told Brooke that same evening, apparently because Brooke texted me the next morning: "Mom told me, so sorry, let me know if you need anything." 3 exclamation points, a single message, no follow-up call. I want to be fair here and say I didn't expect hysterics. I didn't want hysterics. What I wanted and what I didn't yet fully understand I wasn't going to get was simply someone showing up consistently the way I had shown up for this family for 30 years without being asked twice. I want to describe the days immediately following that call, because I think the shape of that first week matters. My father, when my mother finally told him 2 days later, she'd apparently wanted to process it herself first, called me exactly once for 4 minutes, to ask whether my insurance through work was any good. A practical question, not an unreasonable one on its own, but delivered with the same flat, transactional tone he might have used asking about a car repair estimate. I remember sitting on my couch after that call, staring at the wall, trying to name the specific feeling settling into my chest, and eventually landing on something close to loneliness, except loneliness felt too simple a word for it. It was closer to the particular ache of realizing in real time that a lifetime of small evidence I'd been quietly collecting without meaning to, the funeral at 11, the broken wrist at 15, the summer program at 17, had all been pointing toward this exact moment, and that some part of me had apparently already known for 30 years roughly how my family would respond to genuine crisis, long before I ever had to actually test the theory. My double mastectomy was scheduled for March 14th. I asked my mother 2 weeks in advance whether she'd be able to come sit with me during the surgery and the first night of recovery. She said yes initially and then called 4 days before the surgery to explain that Brooke's youngest, then 3, had a preschool moving up ceremony the same week that we really can't miss. You understand, these things only happen once. I told her I understood. I want to be honest that some numb, practiced part of me did understand, immediately, reflexively, the way I'd understood every version of this sentence since I was 11. A different, newer part of me, one I hadn't fully met yet, sat very still in my own kitchen after that call and thought, with a clarity that frightened me slightly, I am about to have both of my breasts removed, and my mother is choosing a preschool ceremony instead. My friend and coworker Yusra drove me to the hospital that morning instead, sat in the waiting room for 6 hours, and stayed the first night in the recliner beside my hospital bed, something no member of my own family offered to do at any point across the entire 11 months that followed. Brooke visited on day 3, for 40 minutes, spending roughly half of that time finalizing details for her own baby shower on her phone while I lay in a hospital bed still adjusting to drainage tubes. I don't say this to villainize her cruelly. I don't think she understood at the moment the specific weight of what she was doing. I think she had simply never once in 37 years been asked to notice anyone else's needs before her own because our family had never once required it of her. I want to describe that 40-minute visit in a bit more detail because a specific exchange from it has stayed with me. At one point, setting her phone down briefly, Brooke looked at me and said, with what I believe was genuine if fleeting tenderness, "This must be so scary, Elena. I don't know how you're doing it." I remember appreciating the sentence in the moment and also noticing, even through the fog of pain medication, that it was phrased entirely as an observation about my strength rather than an offer of anything specific. No follow-up question about what I actually needed that week. No mention of coming back the next day. No acknowledgement that how you're doing it might have an answer more complicated than simple resilience. She picked her phone back up less than a minute later to respond to a bridesmaid's question about shower favors. A small warmth beat because it genuinely wasn't only misery, even in the hardest month. My father's sister, Aunt Patris, the same aunt who'd refilled my wine glass at Brooke's wedding a decade earlier, drove 3 hours from Salem the week after my surgery, stayed 4 nights in my guest room, cooked, cleaned, and asked me gently on the second night, "Has anyone in this family actually asked you how scared you are, honey?" Because I don't think anyone has, and I think you deserve to just say it out loud. I cried for the first time since the diagnosis, that night in my own kitchen, finally given permission by someone who wasn't going to immediately turn my fear into a logistics problem for someone else to manage around. Chemotherapy began April 3rd, 16 rounds total, spaced 2 weeks apart, running through late October. I want to give you a specific, quantifiable picture of what those months actually looked like, because I think the numbers matter more than any general description could. Of the 16 infusion appointments, each lasting between 3 and 5 hours, my mother attended 2. My father attended 0. Brooke attended 0, though she did send flowers twice, a $60 arrangement in May and a $45 arrangement in August, both delivered to my house rather than the infusion center, both accompanied by cards signed only with her name, never her family's, as though the flowers themselves were meant to stand in for a visit she had no intention of making. I drove myself to 14 of those 16 appointments, nauseated, exhausted, sometimes barely able to grip the steering wheel on the way home, because Yusra, generous as she was, had her own job and her own family and could only manage 2 of the appointments herself. I remember, specifically, the 6th round in June when I called my mother from the infusion chair, hoping simply to hear a familiar voice while the IV dripped into my arm, and she spent most of the call describing, in detail, a disagreement she and Brooke were having about the guest list for Brooke's baby shower. I didn't say anything. I sat there, poison entering my bloodstream to save my life, listening to a seating chart dispute, and I remember thinking, with the particular flat clarity chemo sometimes produces, she has no idea where I am right now. She has genuinely forgotten mid-sentence that I am sitting in this chair while she talks to me. I want to include one more specific incident from that stretch from round 9 in late July because it's the one I've thought about most in the months since. I'd asked my mother, several days in advance, whether she might be able to attend that particular appointment, not because it was medically different from any other, but because I'd simply quietly hit a point where I needed one familiar face in that room, and I'd finally allowed myself to ask directly instead of waiting to be offered. She said yes initially, and I remember the specific unfamiliar lightness I felt for those few days, allowing myself to look forward to something. The morning of the appointment, she called at 7:40 to say Brooke needed help watching the girls because a babysitter had canceled, and you understand, don't you, it's just for a few hours. I told her I understood. I drove myself again and sat in that infusion chair alone again, and I remember thinking, with a specific, quiet devastation I hadn't fully let myself feel at any of the previous 8 appointments, that I had finally asked for exactly one thing directly without hedging, and it had still, without hesitation, lost to a canceled babysitter. I called Yusra from the parking garage after that appointment, sitting in my car, unable yet to drive home. She didn't try to fix it or minimize it or offer the kind of brisk reassurance well-meaning people sometimes reach for when they don't know what else to do with someone else's pain. She simply stayed on the phone with me for 40 minutes, mostly in silence, occasionally saying my name until I felt steady enough to drive. I've thought often about the difference between that 40 minutes of quiet, unhurried presence from a coworker I'd known for 6 years and the 40 minutes Brooke spent at my bedside after my mastectomy, half of it on her phone. Both were, technically, 40 minutes. Only one of them actually felt like company. My father's line, the one time I raised the subject directly in a rare phone call in July. Your mother's just trying to keep things normal for everybody, Alina. She doesn't do well with hospitals, you know that about her. I did know that about her. I had known it my whole life, in fact, the same way I'd known since I was 11 that my mother's discomfort would always reliably outrank my actual need. A small warmth beat, Yusra organized without my asking a rotating meal train through our office, and for 4 straight months a warm dinner appeared on my porch 3 nights a week, prepared by coworkers, several of whom I barely knew before that spring. I remember standing at my door one evening in July, too exhausted to cry properly, holding a still-warm casserole dish from a woman in accounting I'd exchanged maybe 6 sentences with before my diagnosis, and understanding with a strange, quiet ache that I was being more consistently cared for by near strangers than by the family who'd raised me. By August, I had lost my hair entirely, developed a persistent low-grade infection that required a brief hospitalization, and was, by any reasonable measure, in the hardest physical stretch of my entire life. My mother called during that hospitalization on August 19th, a date I know precisely because it's logged, along with every other call, in the Notes app folder I'd started keeping without fully admitting to myself why. The call lasted 6 minutes. 4 of those 6 minutes were spent discussing whether I thought Brooke should register for a specific brand of stroller. I want to describe that hospitalization a little further, because it was in many ways the lowest point of the entire year. I was febrile, weak, hooked to IV antibiotics in a hospital room with a view of a parking structure, and I remember specifically the night nurse on shift that week, a woman named Carla, noticing on her second night caring for me that I hadn't had a single visitor. She didn't say anything dramatic about it. She simply started, without being asked, spending a few extra minutes in my room each time she came to check my vitals, telling me small, ordinary stories about her own weekend, her garden, her son's little league game, the kind of small talk that costs a busy nurse almost nothing and yet, in that particular week, felt like the single most substantial act of care I received from anyone. I think about Carla often still, a stranger who happened to notice an empty chair beside my bed and decided quietly to fill some small part of it with her own presence, without ever once being asked to. I want to name, plainly, the mechanism I was living inside by that point, because I think it's the single most important thing in this entire story. My family had built, without ever once discussing it out loud, an entire structure in which my illness was treated as background noise, an unfortunate but ultimately minor disruption to the ongoing, more important business of Brooke's expanding family. That's the machinery of it, not outright cruelty, not dramatic villainy, but a quiet, practiced habit of attention that had been trained into all of us since I was 11 years old, one that simply continued running on autopilot straight through my cancer treatment, because nobody in my family had ever once been required to notice it was running. Radiation began in late September and ran 28 consecutive weekdays through late October. I drove myself to all 28 sessions. My mother visited my house exactly once during that final stretch on October 12th, primarily, as it turned out, to ask whether I'd be well enough by Thanksgiving to host, since your kitchen is so much bigger than ours and it would just be easier for everybody. I said yes. I want to be honest about that because I think it's important to show the full shape of how long this pattern continued, even after everything. I said yes, and I hosted Thanksgiving 9 days after my final radiation session, exhausted, bald, still recovering because saying no to that particular request felt, even then, even after everything, like more work than simply doing what was asked of me one more time. I want to include one more chapter here, briefer than the others because it sets up everything that follows. My scans came back clear in early December, no evidence of disease, the words every cancer patient waits 11 months to hear. I called my mother first, before anyone else, an old habit I hadn't yet unlearned. She was genuinely thrilled, tearful even, and said something that stuck with me for entirely different reasons than she intended. Thank God, I don't think I could have handled it if things had gone differently. I remember sitting with that sentence for a long time after we hung up. My mother, who had attended 2 of 16 chemotherapy sessions, 0 of my surgery, and had spent a hospitalization discussing stroller brands, was expressing relief specifically about her own capacity to handle bad news, rather than anything resembling relief about what I had actually endured. It wasn't malicious, I want to be fair about that. It was simply, finally, undeniable proof of exactly where I had always ranked in her actual, felt priorities, laid bare in a single unguarded sentence at the end of the hardest year of my life. I want to describe the days immediately following that clear scan, because they were stranger than I expected. I'd assumed for months that relief would feel uncomplicated once it finally arrived, that hearing no evidence of disease would simply erase, or at least meaningfully soften, everything that had come before it. Instead, I found myself in the days after, oddly flat, unable to fully access the celebration everyone around me seemed to expect. Yusra threw a small dinner in my honor that weekend, just the 2 of us and 2 other close coworkers. And I remember sitting at that table, genuinely happy, genuinely relieved, and also aware of a second, quieter feeling running alongside the happiness, something closer to grief for the year itself, for the version of me who had driven herself to 14 infusion appointments believing the whole time that expecting anything different from her family was somehow asking too much. Yusra noticed that night without my having to say anything and simply said, refilling my glass, "You're allowed to be glad you survived and still be sad about how alone you were while you were doing it. Those aren't in competition with each other." I've held on to that sentence longer than almost anything else anyone said to me that year. The discovery itself, when it finally came, wasn't dramatic. It happened in late January, roughly 6 weeks after my clear scans, while I was helping my mother sort through a filing cabinet at my parents' house, a mundane Saturday afternoon errand, looking for an old insurance document my father needed for a separate matter entirely. I came across a folder, unlabeled, tucked behind a stack of tax returns, containing 3 things. A printed email exchange between my mother and an estate attorney, dated April of the previous year, 1 month into my chemotherapy, discussing contingency planning in the event Alina's treatment doesn't go as hoped. A rough handwritten list in my mother's handwriting, titled simply House, estimating the resale value of my own home and sketching a proposed split between herself, my father, and Brooke. And a single unsent text message draft, saved on what I recognized as an old phone of my mother's that had been sitting in that drawer for years, addressed to Brooke, that read, "If it comes to that, I think it's only fair you get more since you have the kids and she never did." I sat very still on the floor of my parents' spare bedroom for a long time after I found that folder. I didn't cry and I didn't feel the surge of rage I might have expected. What I felt was quieter and colder than that, the specific, still feeling of watching a shape you'd suspected for months finally resolved into something undeniable. My family hadn't simply been distracted or overwhelmed or bad at hospitals, the excuses I'd spent 11 months quietly accepting on their behalf. At some point during my treatment, while I was driving myself to infusion appointments alone, They had sat down, deliberately, and planned how to divide my life among themselves in the event that I didn't survive it, and had already decided in writing that Brooke deserved a larger share, because I had, in their own words, never done the one thing that would have made my life count for something in their eyes. I want to describe the physical sensation of that afternoon a little further because I think it matters. My hands were steady, oddly steadier than they'd been in months as I photographed each page. I remember noticing, almost clinically, the particular quality of light coming through the spare bedroom's single window, late January, thin and gray, and thinking, with a strange, detached precision, that I would probably remember this exact light for the rest of my life, the way you sometimes remember the weather on the day something ends. I photographed the estate attorney email first, then the handwritten list, then last the unsent text draft, and I remember pausing longest on that final one, rereading the sentence about Brooke deserving more since she has the kids and she never did 3-4 times, testing whether rereading it might somehow soften its meaning. It didn't. I want to include one more detail from that afternoon, because it's small but it mattered enormously to me later. Before I left my parents' house, I stood for a moment in the hallway outside the spare bedroom, looking at a row of family photographs my mother had hung there years earlier, my kindergarten picture, Brooke's dance recital photos, my college graduation, Brooke's wedding, a whole visual timeline of a family that had on its surface always looked ordinary and loving. I remember thinking, staring at my own 11-year-old face in a school photo taken the same year as my grandmother's funeral, that photographs are a strange, incomplete kind of evidence. They show you who stood next to whom, and they tell you nothing at all about who actually showed up when it mattered. I left that hallway understanding, more clearly than I ever had before, that the family I'd been documenting in photographs my entire life, and the family I'd actually experienced during the hardest year of it were, in some fundamental way, two entirely different families, and that only one of them had ever been telling the truth. I photographed all 3 documents with my phone carefully, quietly, and put the folder back exactly where I'd found it. I didn't say a word to my mother that afternoon. I drove home, sat at my kitchen table, and began, calmly, methodically, to build something I hadn't fully let myself plan until that exact moment. I didn't confront my family that week or the next. Instead, 3 days after the discovery, I called Yusra and told her everything, not just the folder, but the entire year in order, starting with the 2 chemo appointments my mother attended and ending with a handwritten list titled House. Yusra listened for a long time without interrupting, which was unusual for her, and when I finished, she said something I've replayed more times than almost anything else from this whole ordeal. Alina, I sat with you through more of this than your own mother did, and even I didn't fully understand until just now how completely they'd already written you off. I need you to actually sit with that instead of rushing past it the way you rush past everything. I didn't rush past it, not that time. I sat with it for the better part of 3 weeks, and I want to walk you through what that actually looked like, because I think this part of the story, the deciding, not the discovering, is the part almost nobody tells the truth about. Finding the folder took an afternoon. Deciding what to do with it took considerably longer, and it wasn't glamorous, and from the outside it looked like almost nothing was happening at all. A woman going to work, coming home, sitting at her kitchen table most evenings with a cup of tea going cold, turning the same handful of sentences over and over. I made an appointment that first week with a therapist named Dr. Adiz Okonkwo, someone Yusra had seen herself years earlier and trusted enough to recommend without hesitation. I went into that first session expecting to talk about anger. Instead, Dr. Okonkwo asked me a question in the first 10 minutes that cracked something open I hadn't let myself look at directly since I was 11 years old in a black dress. Alina, when you imagine telling your family how this year actually felt for you, what's the very first fear that comes up, not the polite version? The actual first one? I sat with that question for a long moment, and the honest answer, when it finally arrived, surprised me with how small and old it turned out to be. If I stop being the one who absorbs everything quietly, do they simply stop needing me at all, the way they've apparently already started planning for? I want to spend real time on this part, because I think it's the emotional center of everything that happened this year, more than the diagnosis itself, more than the folder, even more than the confrontation that eventually followed. The fear wasn't really about losing my family's love. By the time I found that folder, some clear-eyed part of me had already begun to understand that what I'd been calling love for 4 decades had actually been something closer to function. The fear was smaller and in some ways more frightening. If my entire value to this family had always been rooted in my capacity to absorb hardship without complaint, what exactly was left of my relationship with them once I stopped being willing to do that? Dr. Okonkwo helped me trace that fear all the way back over the following several sessions, to that funeral at 11 years old, to the broken wrist at 15, to the summer journalism program I'd given up at 17 because Brooke, apparently, needed me nearby more than I needed to become whoever I might have become on that campus 3 states away. You were assigned a role before you were old enough to negotiate its terms, she told me in our third session, and every family member around you has spent 32 years benefiting from you never questioning the assignment. That's not a character flaw in you, Alina, that's a structure. And structures can be dismantled, but only once you can see them clearly enough to know what you're actually taking apart. I want to describe a specific evening from that stretch because it's the one that finally moved me from sitting with the fear to actually deciding what to do about it. It was a Tuesday in February, almost exactly a year after my original diagnosis, and I was going through old photos on my phone looking for something entirely unrelated, when I came across a picture Yusra had taken without my fully noticing during my 6th round of chemo. Me, bald, exhausted, IV line taped to my arm, phone pressed to my ear, listening to my mother discuss a baby shower seating chart. I hadn't remembered that photo existed. I sat on my couch for a long time looking at my own face in that image, and I understood with total clarity for the first time that the woman in that photo had spent 11 months being profoundly, repeatedly alone in the hardest experience of her life, while telling herself the entire time that this was simply what her family was like, that expecting anything different was somehow unfair to people who just weren't good at hospitals. I want to walk through several more sessions with Dr. Okonkwo in detail here, because I think this is the part of the story that will matter most to anyone listening who recognizes a version of themselves in it. In our 4th session in early March, she asked me to describe, specifically, what being useful had actually got me across 4 decades, not abstractly but concretely, incident by incident. I found myself listing things I hadn't consciously connected before. The $2,200 toward Brooke's culinary tuition at 22, the $3,000 toward my parents' roof at 25, the $4,100 in small untracked loans during Brooke's 14 months back home, the $2,800 toward a wedding I never received an equivalent contribution toward myself. Dr. Okonkwo let me finish the whole list before she said anything. Then she asked quietly, and across all of that, Alina, how many times has anyone in your family asked what you needed, unprompted, before you had to either ask directly or simply absorb the cost yourself? I sat with that question for a long time. I couldn't think of a single instance, not one in over 20 years. That's the actual shape of the role you were assigned, she told me, not the strong one, not the responsible one. The role was the one whose needs are never the starting point of the conversation. And I want you to notice, because I think it matters enormously, that your body eventually forced the issue for you. Cancer doesn't negotiate with a family's comfort level. It doesn't care whether your mother is good with hospitals. For the first time in your life, you had a need large enough that it couldn't be quietly minimized down to a size everyone else found convenient. And instead of rising to meet that need, your family simply treated it the same way they'd always treated your needs, as background noise to be managed around, rather than a foreground event requiring their actual presence. I want to be honest about how much that reframing cost me to hear, even though I'd already on some level arrived at a version of it myself. There's a particular grief in having a professional confirm, in plain clinical language, something you've spent months quietly suspecting about your own family. I cried in that session for the first time in front of Dr. Okonkwo, not the composed, controlled tears I'd occasionally allowed myself in private, but something messier, more prolonged. She let me sit in it without rushing to fix it, which I noticed, even through the tears, was itself a small, quiet demonstration of exactly the kind of presence I'd spent a lifetime not receiving from the people who were supposed to offer it first. In our 6th session, roughly 3 weeks later, I brought up the phone call I'd made to my mother, the one where I'd asked directly about the folder, about what she and Brooke had planned to do with my house. I told Dr. Okonkwo about the long silence on the line, about how that silence had told me everything the words themselves hadn't yet confirmed. What did you feel in that silence? She asked. I thought about it carefully before answering. Relief, I said, surprising myself with the word as it left my mouth. Not happy relief, but relief that I wasn't imagining it anymore, relief that I could finally stop working so hard to explain their absence to myself in kinder terms than it deserved. Dr. Okonkwo nodded slowly. That's an important distinction, she said. A lot of people reaching the moment you just reached expect it to feel like devastation. For some people it does. But for people who have spent decades doing the hardest kind of interpretive labor, constantly translating a family's absence into something bearable, something explainable, something that doesn't require confrontation, the moment the translation finally stops is often, first and foremost, a relief. The devastation, if it comes, tends to come later in smaller waves once the relief has had room to settle. She was right about that, as it turned out. The devastation did come in smaller waves over the following weeks, driving past my parents' old house one afternoon and suddenly, without warning, crying in my car for 20 minutes over a version of my mother I'd apparently been quietly mourning without realizing it. The mother I'd always hoped might eventually show up fully, even after all the evidence suggesting she wouldn't. I want to include that detail because I think it's honest, and because I think grief in stories like this one rarely arrives in one clean, contained moment. It arrives in installments on ordinary Tuesday afternoons, usually when you least expect to be ambushed by it. I mentioned that particular crying spell to Dr. Okonkwo in our next session, half apologetic about it, as though grieving a mother who is still very much alive and reachable by phone somehow didn't count as legitimate grief. She corrected me gently. "You're allowed to grieve a relationship that technically still exists," she said. "In some ways, that kind of grief is harder because there's no clear endpoint, no funeral, no permission slip society hands you to feel the loss fully. You're mourning the mother you needed and didn't get, while the mother you did get is still calling you about kitchen renovations. Both of those things can be true and both of them deserve room." I've returned to that sentence often since, especially on the harder days, the ones where old habits still occasionally tempt me to answer my mother's calls the way I used to before any of this, before I finally let myself count. I want to pause here and name the actual mechanism directly, the way I couldn't fully while I was still living inside it, because I think it matters more than any single incident I've described. That's the machinery of it. A family doesn't need to actively wish harm on someone in order to abandon them. It only needs to have spent decades quietly training itself to treat that person's needs as less urgent than everyone else's, consistently enough for long enough, that when a genuine emergency finally arrives, the old habit simply keeps running, undisturbed, exactly as it always has. Nobody in my family ever said out loud, "Alina's illness matters less than Brooke's baby shower." Nobody had to say it. The habit said it for them in 14 missed infusion appointments and 40 minutes at a hospital bedside and a folder discussing what to do with my house, all without a single person ever consciously deciding to be cruel. I called my mother the next morning not to confront her yet, but simply to ask directly a version of the question Dr. Okonkwo had first asked me. "Mom, if I had died last year, what were you and Brooke planning to do with my house?" There was a long silence on the line, long enough that I knew immediately with total certainty that the folder was real, that the plans were real, that I hadn't misread a single word of what I'd found in that spare bedroom. My mother finally said carefully, "Alina, that's not, we just wanted to be prepared, honey, for a worst-case scenario." Any responsible family does that kind of planning. I didn't argue with her in that moment. I simply said, "Okay," and ended the call shortly after because I understood, finally, that I didn't need her to confirm the folder's contents out loud in order to know they were true. I had photographs. I had 11 months of documented calls. I had a lifetime, going all the way back to a black dress at a funeral, of evidence that had simply, finally, become undeniable once I let myself add it all up in one place instead of forgiving each individual piece of it separately, the way I'd been trained to do since childhood. I made a second appointment that same week, this time with an estate and family law attorney named Renata Solis, recommended by a colleague at work who'd gone through her own complicated inheritance situation years earlier. I didn't go to Renata's office planning to sue anyone. I went because I needed to understand in plain, factual terms what my actual legal position was, what my mother's rough handwritten list of a house split might have meant in practice, whether any of the documents I'd photographed carried legal weight, and more than anything, what my own options actually were, separate from whatever guilt or old habit might otherwise steer me back toward simply absorbing this too. Renata was direct with me in a way I badly needed. "None of what you found is enforceable against you in any way," she told me, reviewing the photographs I'd brought. "It's not a will, it's not a trust document, it's just planning, and frankly, families do sometimes have these conversations, even inappropriate ones, without it meaning anything legally binding ever happens. But I want to ask you something separate from the legal question because I think it might matter more to you right now. What do you actually want the outcome of confronting this to be?" I asked her before answering whether she'd seen situations like this before, families making arrangements around a sick relative's assets while that relative was still very much alive and fighting to stay that way. She was quiet for a moment, professionally careful, and then said, "More often than you'd think. It's rarely as calculated as it looks from the outside in my experience. Usually it's less we hope she dies and more we've stopped being able to imagine a future where she's fully present. So we've started planning around her absence without fully admitting to ourselves that's what we're doing. That doesn't make it less painful to discover, but it might help you understand it as a symptom of how thoroughly they'd already emotionally stopped counting on you being there, rather than proof of something colder and more deliberate than what actually happened." I found that framing useful, though I want to be honest that it didn't fully soften the sting of the handwritten list itself. The specific line about Brooke deserving more since she has the kids and Alina never did. I told Renata about that line directly and she was quiet again before responding. "That part," she said, "is harder to explain away as simple emotional avoidance. That's a value judgment about your worth relative to your sisters made in writing while you were actively fighting for your life. I don't think you need my legal opinion to know how to feel about that part. I think you already know." I sat in her office for a long moment, the same kind of pause I'd sat through in Dr. Okonkwo's office weeks earlier, and I realized again with a small jolt of something close to shame that I hadn't fully let myself answer that question even privately. I had spent 43 years becoming fluent in exactly what my family needed from me: Brooke's comfort, my mother's ease, my father's avoidance of anything difficult, that I had let my own wanting go almost entirely quiet, the way a muscle goes quiet when you stop asking anything of it. It doesn't disappear, it simply waits patiently to finally be asked. I went home that evening and did something I hadn't done in longer than I could remember. I sat at my kitchen table with a blank legal pad and wrote down plainly, without an audience, without managing anyone else's comfort in advance, exactly what I wanted. Not revenge, I want to be honest about that, because it would be easy to tell this part of the story as though I'd spent months quietly plotting an elaborate reckoning. I hadn't. What I wrote down was smaller and, I think, in its own way more devastating than revenge could have been. I wanted my family to see, plainly, undeniably, exactly what they had done, laid out in their own words and their own silence, without a single argument or excuse available to soften it. I wanted, for the first time in my adult life, for the truth of what happened to me to exist outside my own head, documented, undeniable, no longer available to be quietly reframed into a compliment about my strength. Reading that list back was the moment I actually decided, even though the confrontation itself was still weeks away. Over the following 2 weeks, I built a binder, the same methodical, tab-by-tab approach I'd used professionally to present a difficult marketing analysis to a skeptical executive team. Evidence first, narrative second, conclusions last, because I understood that conclusions built ahead of the evidence are how you lose a room before you've even finished speaking. I included the photographed documents from the filing cabinet. I included the notes app log I'd kept almost by accident throughout my treatment. Every call, every visit, every date cross-referenced against my actual treatment calendar, showing in stark, undeniable numbers exactly how present or absent each family member had actually been across 11 months, rather than the vague, generous impression they'd each managed to leave in my memory through sheer force of repeated reassurance. I included a printed record of the $412 in flowers Brooke had sent, set directly beside a printed record of the 218 hours I'd spent alone in infusion chairs, hospital beds, and radiation waiting rooms. There was one evening during that 2-week stretch I want to describe in a little more detail, because it's the closest this whole process came to breaking my resolve before it finished strengthening it. I was cross-referencing my treatment calendar against old text messages trying to establish exact dates, and I came across a message thread from the week of my surgery: Brooke, texting me the morning of my mastectomy, thinking of you today. Sending love, followed 4 hours later in the same thread by an unrelated message clearly meant for someone else entirely, accidentally sent to me instead. Okay, should we do the mermaid theme or the princess theme for the shower? I can't decide. I remember sitting at my kitchen table staring at those two messages 4 hours apart. In the same conversation thread, and understanding with a clarity that arrived almost gently rather than violently, exactly how much space my own surgery had actually occupied in my sister's mind that day, sandwiched between a morning well-wish and an afternoon party-themed decision, treated structurally as roughly equivalent events. I sat with that for a long while. Then I added the screenshot to the binder and I kept working, because I had learned over 11 months of treatment that grief and competence weren't mutually exclusive states, and that sometimes the only way through one was to keep quietly practicing the other. I want to say something plainly here because I think it matters more than almost anything else in this story. I did not build that binder to punish my family for being imperfect or even for being frightened, which I do believe genuinely some of their absence partly was. I built it because I needed, finally, at 43 years old, for the actual shape of what had happened to me to be visible to the same people who had spent an entire year quietly, comfortably, telling themselves a much gentler version of the story. I chose Easter dinner, held that year at my parents' house, the first full family gathering since my diagnosis where every member of my immediate family, my mother, my father, Brooke, and Dale, would be in the same room at the same time. I brought the binder in a plain canvas bag and set it beside my chair, unopened, through the ham, through Brooke's youngest showing everyone a drawing of a bunny, through my mother's comment, twice repeated, about how well I seemed to be doing these days. I remember sitting at that table beforehand, watching the familiar rhythms of an ordinary family dinner unfold around me, my father carving the ham the same careful way he'd carved it my entire childhood, my mother fussing over whether the rolls had browned enough, Nora and her younger sister giggling over something at the far end of the table. It struck me, watching it all, how easily this ordinary scene could have simply continued indefinitely, with me quietly folding the folder's discovery into the same private drawer where I'd filed every other piece of evidence for 4 decades. Nobody in that room, aside from me, had any idea that the shape of the entire afternoon was about to change. I remember feeling in that stretch of waiting not fear exactly, but something closer to the specific, focused calm I used to feel standing at the infusion center reception desk, checking in for round after round, knowing exactly what was coming and choosing deliberately to walk toward it anyway. When the plates were cleared, I opened the bag. "I want to talk about last year," I said. My voice didn't shake. I had practiced that beforehand, the same calm, factual register I used presenting a difficult quarter to a room full of skeptical executives, because I understood that volume never makes a hard truth easier to hear, only harder. Specifically, I want to talk about 16 chemotherapy sessions, 2 of which anyone in this family attended. I want to talk about a mastectomy nobody in this family sat with me for. And I want to talk about a folder I found in your filing cabinet, Mom, in January, discussing what to do with my house in the event my treatment didn't go as hoped. The table went silent in a way I'd never heard it go silent before, not the ordinary pause of a family waiting for someone to pass the potatoes, but something closer to a held breath. My mother's face went pale almost instantly, and she started speaking quickly, the way people do when they've never once had to build a case for their own conduct because nobody had ever asked them to. "Elena, that was contingency planning. Every family does that. It doesn't mean we weren't thinking about you every single." "I have the numbers," I said quietly, not raising my voice to meet hers. 2 visits out of 16 infusions, 40 minutes at my bedside after a double mastectomy. 6 minutes on the phone during a hospitalization, 4 of which were about a stroller. I'm not asking you to explain any of it away. I'm telling you I finally added it up, and I need you to hear the total. My father, silent through most of it, finally spoke quietly, not quite meeting anyone's eyes. "Denise," he said, "is the folder real?" And there was something almost unbearable in the fact that it took 39 years of marriage and this exact moment for him to finally ask his wife a question he'd apparently never once thought to ask before. My mother didn't answer him directly. She looked at the binder, then at me, and said, in a smaller voice than anything she'd used all evening, "We were scared, Elena, scared of losing you. People do strange things when they're scared." "I don't doubt that you were scared," I said. "I was scared too every single day for 11 months in an infusion chair, mostly alone. But you didn't spend that fear showing up. You spent it planning what to do with my house if I didn't make it, and deciding in writing that Brooke deserved more of it than I did because I never gave you grandchildren. That's not fear, Mom. That's a choice made deliberately while I was still alive to have made a different one available to you instead." Brooke, who had said almost nothing the entire meal, finally spoke, her voice unsteady. "I didn't know about the folder, I swear, Elena, I didn't know Mom actually wrote that." I looked at her for a long moment, and I found, to my own quiet surprise, that I believed her and that believing her didn't actually change very much. "Maybe you didn't know about the folder specifically," I said, "but you knew about the 40 minutes. You knew about the flowers instead of visits. You knew the whole time, and you let it happen because it was easier than asking yourself what it meant that I was the one who always showed up for you, and you were never once in 37 years the one who showed up for me." Dale, Brooke's husband, silent through the entire meal until this point, spoke up quietly. For what it's worth, Alina, I remember telling Brooke more than once last year that we should be doing more. I should have pushed harder on that. I'm sorry I didn't. It wasn't a dramatic statement, and he had no particular reason to say anything at all, being only an in-law to this specific family drama. But I remember being oddly moved by it, precisely because it came from someone with nothing to gain and nothing to lose either way, someone who had simply, quietly been keeping his own private observations for a year, the way I had for a lifetime. Brooke's older daughter, Nora, 7 that year, broke the long silence that followed by asking, in the flat, curious voice children use when they haven't yet learned to filter a question for the room's comfort, "Is Annalena mad at everybody?" Nobody answered her right away. I did eventually, because I decided in that moment that she deserved a true answer more than the room deserved a comfortable one. "A little," I said, "but mostly I just want everybody to know what actually happened so it doesn't happen again to somebody else someday." She nodded, seemingly satisfied with the directness of it, and went back to coloring on the back of her placemat, and something in that small, matter-of-fact exchange did more to steady me than anything the adults at that table had managed all evening. Nobody at that table had anything to say to that for a long time. My father reached over slowly and closed his hand over mine on the table, the first physical gesture of comfort he'd offered me, I realized with a small, sharp ache, since long before any of this began. It wasn't an apology, not exactly. But it was the first time in this entire story that anyone in my immediate family had reached toward me instead of waiting for me to reach toward them. I want to be honest with you up front. Nothing about the weeks that followed Easter dinner unfolded the way a satisfying story might promise. My mother called twice in the following month, both times to explain at length why the folder had been misunderstood, never once landing fully on an apology that didn't also, somewhere inside it, ask me to reassure her that I still saw her as a good mother. I stopped answering those calls after the second one. I'm not angry about that decision, even now. I simply understood finally that I was no longer willing to spend my own recovery managing her comfort about a truth she herself had created. I want to describe the second of those two calls in a little more detail, because it's the clearest single example in this entire story of the mechanism I'd spent a year learning to name. My mother spent nearly 15 minutes on that call describing how hurt she'd been by the way I'd raised the folder in front of everyone at Easter, how embarrassed she'd felt, how she'd barely slept since. Not once, across those 15 minutes, did she mention the contents of the folder itself or the 11 months that had preceded it. I remember sitting with the phone against my ear, recognizing with a kind of exhausted clarity that she had once again managed to relocate the emotional center of the story onto her own discomfort, this time about being confronted rather than about her original absence. I said, gently but firmly, "Mom, I hear that the dinner was hard for you. I need you to also hear that the folder was harder for me." She was quiet for a moment and then said, "I don't know what you want me to say," which I've come to understand in the months since might be the single most honest sentence she said to me across that entire year, an admission, unintentional but real, that she genuinely did not have the emotional vocabulary to meet me where I actually was. My father called once alone in May and said simply, "I should have asked more questions over the years about a lot of things. I'm sorry, Alina, I don't expect that to fix anything." I told him I appreciated him saying it, and I meant that. I don't know even now whether it represents a real shift in him or simply a single honest moment inside a much longer pattern that will likely continue mostly unchanged. I've made peace with not knowing which one it turns out to be. Brooke and I talk occasionally now, carefully in a way we never had to be careful with each other before. She sent me a message in June that I've kept. "I keep thinking about the flowers instead of visits. I don't know how to undo that, but I wanted you to know what I think about it. It isn't an apology exactly, and it certainly isn't repaired. But it's more honest than anything she'd said to me in 37 years, and I've decided, for now, that honesty is worth something, even when it arrives 11 months too late to have changed the year it's actually describing." I want to describe one more exchange with Brooke from later that summer because it's the closest we've come to something resembling an actual conversation about all of it rather than a single message. We met for coffee in July, our first time alone together since Easter, and she asked me carefully partway through, "Do you think you'll ever actually forgive Mom?" I told her honestly that I didn't know. That forgiveness felt to me like a destination I wasn't sure I was interested in reaching on any particular timeline, and that I'd stopped treating it as the required final chapter of a story like this one. Brooke was quiet for a moment and then said, "I think I've spent my whole life assuming forgiveness was just what family does automatically, no matter what. I don't think I ever really thought about whether it had to be earned first. I remember that being one of the more genuinely reflective things she'd said to me in years, and I told her so. It didn't erase anything, but it felt for the first time like a real conversation between two adults rather than the old, familiar shape of an older sister managing a younger one's comfort. I'm not going to tell you this ended in some tidy, total reconciliation because it didn't, and I don't trust stories that claim it always does. My relationship with my mother remains distant, functional at best, built now on a foundation of documented fact rather than the softer, more forgiving mythology we'd both quietly maintained for 4 decades. I don't know if that will ever fully repair. Some days I hope it will. Most days I've made peace with the possibility that it might not, and that peace didn't come from forgiving her for the folder. It came from no longer needing her to be sorry in order for me to be fine. There's a small, genuinely redemptive thread to this, though, and it's the part I think about most. Brooke's older daughter, Nora, 7 years old, asked her mother recently, apparently out of nowhere, why Aunt Alina drove herself to the hospital so many times last year. Brooke told her honestly, as far as I know, for the first time in that household, because we weren't there enough and that wasn't okay, and I'm trying to be better about it. Nora, according to Brooke, thought about that for a moment and said, "I'm gonna go with you next time someone's sick." I think about that far more than I expected to. A 7-year-old, a full generation earlier than either Brooke or I ever managed, learned that showing up isn't optional and that noticing when you haven't is the actual beginning of love, not simply an uncomfortable footnote to it. Nora actually did come with Brooke that August to a routine follow-up appointment of mine, unprompted, insisting, according to Brooke, that she wanted to see what the hospital looked like so she'd know where to find me if it ever happened again. I remember sitting in that waiting room, my 7-year-old niece coloring quietly in the chair beside me, and feeling something loosen in my chest that I hadn't fully realized was still clenched. Not forgiveness for the adults in my family, not yet, maybe not ever fully, but something adjacent to hope, watching a child choose entirely on her own, to be the kind of family member none of the adults around her had quite managed to be. I don't know what Nora will grow into or whether this particular instinct in her will survive 30 more years inside a family structure built the way ours was. But I know what I witnessed that afternoon, and I've decided to let it matter, regardless of what comes after it. As for me, I want to tell you honestly what recovery has actually looked like in the 14 months since my clear scans. My friendship with Yusra deepened into something I now consider, without exaggeration, one of the most stable relationships of my adult life. I started quietly seeing someone new this spring. A man named Theo, a physical therapist I met of all places, during a follow-up appointment for lingering shoulder stiffness from the mastectomy. And I've noticed dating him how strange and wonderful it is to be with someone who asks how I'm actually doing and then waits patiently for the real answer instead of the easy one. I redecorated the guest room where Aunt Patris once stayed for 4 nights, turning it into a proper office, and I keep on the shelf above my desk the folder I built for that Easter dinner, not because I need it anymore, but because I think some part of me wants a permanent, physical reminder that the truth, once fully assembled, doesn't need anyone else's permission to be real. I want to include one final detail about Theo, because it says something I think matters. On our 3rd date, I told him carefully, watching for his reaction, about the year I'd just been through, not the full version, not yet, just the shape of it. He didn't offer advice or platitudes or any of the well-meaning but slightly hollow reassurances I'd grown used to receiving from people who meant well, but didn't quite know what to do with a story this specific. He simply said, "That sounds like it was really lonely," and let the sentence sit there, uncorrected, unsoftened, exactly as heavy as it actually was. I remember driving home that night thinking that it had taken me 43 years, a cancer diagnosis, and a folder full of evidence to finally learn to recognize what actual presence sounds like when it's offered to me, and that recognizing it, once I finally could, turned out to be its own quiet, unexpected form of recovery, separate from anything a scan could measure. Here's what I know now, and it's the thing I wish someone had told me plainly at 11 years old, standing in a black dress 2 sizes too big at my grandmother's funeral, absorbing a hard thing so my younger sister could be spared it. When a family reframes their absence as your independence, they get to keep their comfort and your gratitude at the same time. I spent 32 years earning love by being the one who never needed anything, and it turns out you cannot actually earn love that way, because the moment you finally do need something, you find out with total clarity exactly how much of it was ever real to begin with. I wasn't strong because I didn't need them. I was strong because I survived not having them, and eventually I stopped mistaking the second thing for the first. I think about that distinction often now, usually on ordinary evenings, sitting in the office where Aunt Patris once stayed for 4 nights, the folder still on the shelf above my desk, no longer needed as evidence, kept instead as a kind of quiet monument to the year I finally stopped translating my family's absence into something gentler than it actually was. It took a diagnosis, a discovery, and a binder to get me there. I hope it doesn't take that much for anyone listening who recognizes a version of this in their own life. Sometimes the addition alone is enough once you finally let yourself do the math. If any part of this story felt familiar, if you've ever been praised for handling something alone that you never should have had to handle alone in the first place, I want to hear about it. Tell me your version in the comments, whatever shape it took in your own life. Share this with someone who needs to hear that documentation isn't bitterness, it's clarity, and that noticing the truth of how you were treated is sometimes the first real act of healing a person can offer themselves. And if you want more stories like this one, subscribe, because there are a lot more families out there mistaking someone's resilience for permission, and a lot more people just now realizing they're allowed to stop being grateful for surviving alone. I'll see you in the next one, and until then, keep your own records. You never know which year you'll finally need to add them all up.